Do 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 do. Then another one gone, and another one gone, and another one bites dust. Yeah. Excuse me for providing you with a musical intro, but it is fitting when now we have many candidates biting the dust, the most significant of which being Kamala Harris, who today, as I'm sure you are all aware, dropped out of the race in what came as a shock to some, although it really should not have been. I admit I was probably, I would say, mildly surprised that it happened now. I thought she might have dragged it out a little while further. But this one is really embarrassing both for her campaign, for the Democratic intelligentsia, and especially for the media who pumped her up to such an astonishing degree that earlier this year, before the contours of the primary race had really formed, they were declaring her the front runner. I can give you the quote unquote receipts on that. Receipts. Nate Silver, in his infinite wisdom, was running around screaming that Kamala was the front runner. And he said it with almost a certain smug certitude that, you know, on the one hand, you can kind of forgive people for analytical error. Everybody makes mistakes. Presidential campaigns are fluid. You can't predict the future. But at the same time, if your analysis of the fundamentals were so off that you were willing to go ahead and proclaim Kamala Harris to be the front runner candidate, then that not only warrants mockery, which of course it does, it warrants a wholesale dismissal of your political judgment and your analytical acuity. So if you have people in the media like Nate Silver and, you know, his proteges who are now at different outlets such as Harry Anton, and they're claiming that based on their, you know, statistical genius, they can infer that Kamala Harris is a leading candidate, that's got to call into question their overall abilities in a way that I think really needs to be pointed out, because these people wield a lot of influence. And especially in the case of Nate Silver, they kind of dictate conventional wisdom. So what the pundits really tried to do, I think, this is my theory, and I wrote a column on this today at The Spectator, which I will link to once the stream is over. But I think what the pundits really did in their zeal to declare Kamala the frontrunner earlier on this year, obviously as things broke down for her, they couldn't stick to that anymore. So they had to move on to new storylines. But sort of looking back and reminiscing on how they treated her candidacy, say, from January to maybe May or so, the thing to sort of bear in mind is that pundits attempt to make manifest their own political preferences in the electorate, which is to say, they want their own ideological prescriptions to be actualized in the electorate because it validates their beliefs. So when they sort of pretend to be just analyzing or impartially calling balls and strikes, most of the time what they're simply doing is attempting to graft their own worldview onto that of the voters. And most of the time that fails spectacularly because, shocker, but most voters do not share the same political inclinations as this very narrow sliver of elite opinion makers who comprise the political media landscape. So why did they rush so quickly to anoint Kamala the frontrunner? I think it's because Kamala, for them, sort of embodied what they thought the ideal or the proper Democratic nominee would look like in the current political environment. I don't mean look like strictly on identity grounds, although that's part of it. They do feel as though that the beating heart of the Democratic Party are women and people of color, whatever that means exactly on a given day is up for debate. But that's sort of the vague notions that they have swirling around their heads. And they viewed Kamala as sort of relatively new on the scene, which is all it was a plus for them because it's sort of like a new and exciting story. And they viewed her as like almost treading a certain ideological line within the Democratic Party coalition. So she had certain quote unquote progressive elements to her, but she could also play nice with the establishment elements, with the money interests, so she could unify the disparate factions of the coalition in that way. This is their thinking in terms of the pundits who prematurely crowned her essentially the winner. And that to them was an exciting prospect. Somebody like that fulfilling the role of Democratic nominee, making a formidable contrast to Trump in their minds. That's, I think, what animated their false perception that she was so strong a candidate. And so things kind of went on without much went on uneventfully, essentially, until the first debate, when the media fell over themselves in celebratory, jubilation about this premeditated pot shot that Kamala now infamously took at Joe Biden in the first debate, when she basically calculated ahead of time that she's going to call out old Joe on his decades-old position on racial issues, which mysteriously had never come up throughout the entirety of his tenure as vice president, and only now had been sort of unearthed because people wanted a convenient attack line. And sure enough, it became sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because the media did react extremely positively to that. They liked the excitement. They liked the conflict. They liked the generational contrast and this new up-and-coming vibrant senator, standing her ground against entitled old Joe. And sure enough, in the immediate aftermath of that debate in June, Kamala's poll numbers did trend upward, but it was just a blip. I likened it to a sugar high. It was not something that was sustainable or lasting. It was just this kind of reflexive, immediate reaction to something that had been depicted by the media as a turning point in the race, but wasn't really a turning point for anybody except the media people commentating on it. Except that it kind of created this plot twist for their narrative purposes, which is, of course, what they always want. I mean, that makes the race exciting. Because otherwise, if it's just kind of like, Biden muddling along with like 28 to 32%, Bernie second, Warren third, I mean, eventually that's not especially interesting for the media, who have so much invested professionally on this race being exciting, so that they wanted to throw a monkey wrench into things. And that also explains their reaction to that June event. But after that June debate, the facade had really collapsed. I mean, it had collapsed before then as well. And the polling boost that she got after that debate was really just sort of a mask to the fundamental problems of her campaign, which is that it was sort of predicated on contradictions and fallacies. And she had no ideological core. Not that all Americans are necessarily intensely ideological and want that in their leaders. Trump didn't really have a strong ideological core. Arguably, Obama didn't either. So that's not a be-all, end-all for voters. But if you're like Kamala, where you're just basically oscillating back and forth constantly between different kind of shticks, different throwaway, like thematic devices, different tactics. Like eventually she shut down her operation in New Hampshire and said she was basically going to live in Iowa. She got caught telling a fellow senator recently that she's going to effing move to Iowa, which, probably wasn't the greatest sign, because you're basically showing your cards and saying you're just going to focus almost exclusively on one contest, which means that you don't have the resources to distribute evenly. But ultimately, Kamala was running based on the strength of her own persona rather than wanting to accomplish anything that was tangible in a policy or like in a philosophical way. And that only gets you so far. I mean, you have to be extraordinarily talented politically and skillful and adroit and almost conniving in order to pull that off, which Trump was able to do, Obama was able to do, I guess, to some degree. But Trump and Obama both did it in a way that sort of intuited the prevailing political sentiments of the eras that they respectively ran in. Whereas for Kamala, you'd almost don't detect any kind of intense desire for somebody who lacks any core convictions and is just running based on the supposed wonder of their own, personal style. So, I mean, you can pull sort of like a hollow campaign like that off, but there have to be a whole bunch of other factors that are working in your favor, and that just wasn't the case for Kamala. I mean, she didn't really demonstrate prior to this race that she could run on a national level and take the scrutiny that comes with that. Now, when I say that her campaign was predicated on sort of fallacies, one big one is, the pundits sort of christened her frontrunner because they just assumed wrongly and spuriously that she was automatically going to connect with black voters, a large bulk of whom in the Democratic primary are concentrated in the Deep South. Now, their basis for saying that, for prognosticating that, was purely that Kamala vaguely shares their skin pigmentation, which is incredibly condescending. I mean, what these elite commentators do, maybe unwittingly, is that they reduce the preferences of voters who they claim to be speaking on behalf of to a caricature. They basically are calling them dumb, as if black voters in the Deep South don't take into account a whole variety of ideological, political identity, and other considerations when they're formulating a voter preference. Why would it make any sense whatsoever that Kamala Harris, a lawyer with a law enforcement background from Berkeley, California, who is mixed race and who has a husband whose name is Douglas Elmoff, I think it is. We just looked that up, so I don't want to get her husband's name wrong. I just want to cover my bases here because I'm making a larger point. Yeah, Doug. So that's Kamala Harris, and yes, her skin pigmentation does vaguely resemble that of voters in the Deep South, but the idea that that's going to be sufficient for them to support a candidate is remarkably condescending. They wrongly analogized her initially to Obama. Now, leave aside any kind of normative judgments about Obama as a political figure or candidate or a president. Obama had a unique set of assets where he was marinated in predominantly black political scenes in Chicago. And then he coupled that with attentiveness toward rural concerns, because remember, he was legislating in Springfield, Illinois as a state senator. And then he coupled that as well by making really significant inroads with white political elites. So he had sort of this perfect storm of political resources from which to draw on that made him uniquely suited to winning the 2008 primaries and eventually supplanting Hillary with black voters. And it wasn't just that Obama was black that Southern black voters opted to vote for him, although that was obviously a factor. It can't be not a non-factor. But it was because he showed that he had a breadth of appeal that they were comfortable with, and he also, he was sort of trained in the cadences of the black church. He could go before a black religious audience and speak compellingly before them, and sort of almost sound like a preacher, and didn't come across as stilted or forced or cliched, which is unique. And then also, and I mentioned this in the Spectator piece, and people might not like to hear it, but it's true. Obama married into a family who were descendants of American slaves. Obama himself was not a descendant of American slaves. But if we're talking about identity, then that's a factor which just got bizarrely glossed over in terms of these extremely premature proclamations of Kamala's appeal to black voters. I mean, you don't think Michelle Obama played a huge role in why Barack ended up acquiring the amount of black support that he did? Of course it was a factor. And Kamala just did not have that asset. And it just gets to how superficial the discussion of identity is, especially with around Kamala, not just with respect to the Obama analogy, but just think of like what they in their minds, in terms of the idiot pundits, they sort of distill identity to like one narrow factor. Usually it's skin color or sometimes gender. Okay. But even those two, I mean, in terms of skin color, that's only one facet of identity. How about geography? Are Southern black voters automatically going to have a natural kinship with lawyers from Berkeley, California? Of course not. Geography is just as salient, arguably, a factor as skin color or gender in terms of American electoral politics. Maybe even more salient. How about professional background? Again, say what you will about Obama, but while Kamala was cultivating a career in law enforcement, Obama was practicing civil rights law in Chicago. And that just comes across differently to people. So this idea that you're going to, with sort of tunnel vision, focus exclusively on skin color as like a basis to analogize them is just idiotic. I almost think that people who would make an analogy like that have never spoken to any voters, because it's just not how people think. And so now you have like Democratic professionals up in arms because they're so outraged that the candidates currently qualified for the next debate later this month are only white. So there are no non-white candidates currently qualified. Something tells me that if Tulsi were to qualify, which is probable, she has like, I think, 9 or 10 days to do so. That's not going to placate their concerns, because she doesn't register to them as a person or woman of color. I mean, she doesn't think that they don't think that she's like legitimately a person of color in a way that would like satisfy their identity criteria. So, that doesn't count to them. Yang may qualify soon, and he's maybe the most high profile Asian political figure ever in American history, but he doesn't count as like a real person of color in their minds. So he doesn't count either. So that whole complaint isn't really about identity as such. It's about kind of imposing your own ideological presuppositions on to a individual who you think is a vehicle for sort of carrying forth your presuppositions. Or to put it another way, it's not so much that you're concerned with identity per se. It's you're concerned with your political views being expounded by someone who you view to have a favorable identity. Because whenever you sort of just do minimal probing about some of these identity conceits, they always fall apart upon like minimal scrutiny. But you'll have this chorus of people, insist it's like a version of the Hillary apologia in miniature. You'll have people who want to blame everything for Kamala's demise other than Kamala herself, because she was like inhibited by all these sinister and nefarious forces that prevented her from getting the traction that she was owed. And one thing that is so bizarre to me about that is I was somebody who followed the 2008 primaries intensely closely. Some of you may know about this. I've spoken about it before, but I was like an Obama super volunteer, and that I sort of went to New Hampshire and campaigned for him. I volunteered for the campaign in various places. I registered voters. So I wasn't looking at it from a journalistic standpoint then, but I was looking at it with enough analytical detachment, so to say, to recognize that Obama was winning that primary in part because he was doing exceedingly well in states that were like 99% white. He won the Iowa caucus, which was a gigantic historic first, overwhelmingly white state. It wasn't just Iowa. He then went on and won some of the most predominantly white states in the entire country, like Vermont, Maine, Montana, Idaho, Utah. So, that was his wheelhouse in 2008. And for now people to say that, the Democratic Party is like systematically inhospitable to candidates of color, it's just like, are we supposed to forget about the most recent Democratic president who served 2 terms and was a black man? Like, how does that now just sort of cast aside as irrelevant? It's really bizarre, and obviously it's all in service of providing like a ready-made set of excuses for somebody like Kamala, who had so many self-inflicted flaws, and that explains why her campaign collapsed in the way that it did. Now, the most amusing explanation for Kamala's demise is, of course, that Tulsi, basically took a baseball bat to her in that debate in Detroit in July, and Kamala never recovered. And there is something to that because Kamala had never really been challenged before on a national stage, and Tulsi didn't just attack her. She attacked the core conceit of her campaign, which was this progressive prosecutor mantra, which there had been a lot of criticism of even in the months before in left-wing media and elsewhere about how that was just sort of a contradiction in terms. How can you run around saying that you're a tough on crime prosecutor, but you're also progressive? I mean, Kamala wrote an entire book trying to resolve that contradiction and never really did. But Tulsi brought it all out into the open on a national stage, and Kamala could not respond compellingly, to the point that if you read the New York Times article from last week about the collapse of Kamala's campaign, Kamala donors were so unnerved about Kamala's inability to effectively respond to that attack that they got on a conference call with her and demanded that she more aggressively strike back at Tulsi, which is hilarious because that same night, as everybody knows, and which is now infamous, Kamala went on TV and said, I'm a top tier candidate, so I'm not going to pay too much attention to the nagging of this minor candidate who, shouldn't even be in the same room with me. And look who now is in the race longer than Kamala. Wow, Tulsi. So you always get ironies like that over the course of a long campaign, and you could kind of see it coming, but it is still delicious to witness when it actually comes to fruition. And so, funnily enough, eventually Kamala did sort of accede to the demands of her donors, and in her final hurrah, her last rodeo, a couple weeks ago at the most recent debate, Kamala, with an assist from MSNBC, as you remember, all of a sudden decided to launch into this anti-Tulsi diatribe and just rattle through the talking points, I guess, to kind of please the donors who had been calling for that. And so, as I sort of speculate in the Spectator column, maybe that was just sort of like some emotional gratification on Kamala's part. Like she knew that stuff was things that were falling apart. So she thought, maybe I'll just get in this final barb and like try to avenge my honor against Tulsi. And hey, if that's really what she felt she needed to do, okay. But fittingly enough, the way that Kamala exited the race also strikes me as disingenuous. I mean, it just seems a bit random, right? She had at least two fundraisers scheduled for just this week with like high dollar donors, including one today. And then I read that she was going to fly immediately afterwards to Los Angeles to have another high dollar donor fundraiser. So it's not as if the money had entirely dried up yet. And if you think that you are so uniquely suited to to take on Trump, wouldn't you try to pursue that until the final breath, especially with like 9 months worth of energy put into this endeavor? She had very recently been saying, "Oh, I'm all in Iowa. I'm going to be living there. I'm going to go directly to the voters and make the case for myself, and it's going to be fantastic." And then what happens? And then on top of that, she was guaranteed a spot in this next debate later this month, which most candidates in the race, even now, are not guaranteed that, including Tulsi, including Yang, Booker, Castro, others, including two who just dropped out to a much less fanfare yesterday and Sunday, Steve Bullock and Joe Sestak. So even if Kamala's chances were dwindling, and even if maybe the campaign was on life support, to use a cliche, why not use whatever opportunity you have available to you to try to like make some dramatic turnaround? See if you could get on the debate stage and have a moment or something happens. Who knows? And so for her to shutter the campaign now and sort of just terminate everything, really, I think speaks to a fundamental lack of confidence that she had in the kind of core precepts of her campaign. There was just not enough of a message there. And if you have a really strong message and if you're clear on what you want to achieve and everybody understands why you're running for president, then you can sort of weather these storms more easily, I would say. But if you're just kind of flailing back and forth between random strategies and slogans and tactical gambits, then, at a certain point, you say, what am I doing? So the reason I think she got out now, I think, goes back to the fundamental hollowness or shallowness of her campaign, which was always sort of predicated on media hype and fallacious assumptions about the electorate. And it all came back to bite her. So we shall see what happens from here. Interesting times. Mike Bloomberg's role in this, I think, should be considered. He's somebody who is now making candidates second guess their financial viability because they see somebody who just got into the race and has unlimited funds. And that puts additional strain on them if they feel like they're in financial hardship. So Bloomberg's only been in the race for a little over a week, and he's already sort of changing the dynamics of the race. And recall that when this New York Times shortly before this New York Times piece from last week came out, it was reported that one of Kamala's top aides, let me just get her name because I want to make sure everybody is aware, because this is somebody who personifies just the transactional nature of the professional political operative class to such a degree that it's almost grotesque. Kelly messed to such a degree that it's almost grotesque. Kelly Mellenbacher, formerly one of the top kind of operations people for the Kamala campaign, wrote a scathing resignation letter, which was subsequently leaked to the New York Times. And what did she do? She went right to the Bloomberg operation. Now, what does it say that this woman could so seamlessly transition from Kamala to Bloomberg? You tell me. My theory is, although I would like to believe that Tulsi single-handedly destroyed her campaign, and there is an argument for that, I think that the most proximate cause of Kamala's decision to end the campaign probably was the New York Times article last week, which you should Google, or I've tweeted about it, which basically just detailed the utter collapse of the entire operation. It had the resignation letter. It showed how there was, crippling infighting, how, apparently Kamala's sister was running things into the ground, how nobody knew what the message was. It was just disastrous in terms of how that was described by the New York Times article, which was very deeply sourced. So I think there's a chance that Kamala could have kept it going for at least a little while longer, if not for that New York Times article, which is basically just the death knell of the campaign. But if you want a more amusing spin on things, let's just let ourselves believe that it was Tulsi who just stuck a knife through the heart and came away with a scalp. All right, people, like I said, I'm going to enclose or embed the link to the Spectator column in the piece. And I'm sure there'll be much to talk about in the near future. So have a good evening, and I will talk to you later.